Hello and welcome to our very first episode of Brandersation.
A conversation about Brandon Sanderson.
Would you like to destroy some evil today, Sophie?
Yes. This will be our only non-spoiler episode, so you have as long as it takes for us to make another video to read all of Brandon Sanderson's works so that you don't have stuff spoiled for you in the future.
Since you'll be wanting to watch every video that we come out with.
Obviously.
We decided that we were going to put together a list of reasons why we think everyone in the world should be reading Brandon Sanderson.
So our first reason is that Sanderson is a current writer who publishes pretty much constantly and is extremely prolific in his publishing. This year alone, he's publishing 4 books that he wrote in secret without anyone even on his team knowing, I think.
While still writing the books that he's promised to be writing.
Yes. He even has on his official website sort of percentage bars of his completion of various books and their drafts. So you kind of constantly can tell when he's going to be releasing a book. And you can just know that he's committed to finishing the stories that he starts.
Unlike other authors we could not mention.
George R.R. Martin was supposed to deliver The Wind's a Winner to his publisher over 2 years ago.
Yes.
But yeah, he's so committed and he's writing books now. So even though that doesn't make him a good writer, it is one good reason to get into any of his series is because there's an active community out there now. Everyone waiting with bated breath for his next books. And at least for me, every time I've gone and bought a Sanderson book at the bookstore, the cashier always is like, oh my gosh, I love this series. I just got started on this book, or I just finished that book, or it just feels like, especially in that world of bookstores, I guess, a lot of people are reading him. So it's sort of like a very welcoming community. Tons of memes out there.
Oh, yeah. The memes.
And you experienced also waiting for Rhythm of War to come out, the 4th book in the Stormlight Archive. And you went to the bookstore on the day it was published, right?
Yeah, the day it came out, I got it from the store and began reading it. And that day, there were memes being made by fans of the first couple chapters.
And also, it's not like you have to commit to the series once you start reading it. I started off reading the Mistborn trilogy, and you can read the first book of that and be satisfied. I say that with quotation marks for those of you just listening, because it ends satisfactorily. So you can get started on something like that rather than getting started on the Stormlight Archive, where the first book is 1,000 pages and you have just no experience reading a book of that volume. All right, our second reason is also a little bit less to do with Brandon Sanderson himself. I promise we'll get to Brandon Sanderson himself and his amazing writing skills. But this is more to do with in case if you are thinking you would not be interested in his books because he writes fantasy. And we wanted to add a reason sort of defending fantasy as literature.
Oh, yeah, because a lot of people, I'm extremely generalizing, but I imagine a lot of people are like, oh, this looks like a cool book, and then they look at the cover and they're like, oh, big swords and rocks, that's fantasy stuff. We don't want
Rocks
none of
is
that.
fantasy stuff.
In Stormlight Archive, yeah, there's rocks everywhere. There's
just tons of
character
rocks
named Rock.
No, that's true. Basically, having experienced people out there in the world who sort of view fantasy as a genre that's either for younger people or just a genre that is sort of like, oh, this is just something people read to sort of escape the everyday life, and it doesn't really mean a whole lot.
Yeah. It's generally seen as a lesser form of literature.
Yeah.
And, the great novels by F. Scott Fitzgerald or whoever.
Well, which is kind of crazy because Shakespeare has, Midsummer Night's Dream. Yeah, we just wanted to talk about why we think fantasy is a valuable form of literature. And I think that people are willing to sort of say, okay, Lord of the Rings, that is just, some excellent writing and prose, and I don't know, maybe because it's an older book, it sort of gets a little bit of leeway, but in my mind, Brandon Sanderson is just as fantastic, and he uses fantasy basically by allowing us to sort of experience the extremes of being a human. For example, a lot of us, like in fantasy books, you can have someone has to do something absolutely courageous, face the dragon, or they give their life for their friend, and these things, sometimes people do experience these big moments in real life, but oftentimes ordinary people don't really, their big moments are maybe more of courageous things that they do in their work life, or standing marriage, standing up to their boss, things that happen in their family. You in this world, like, you have to be a courageous and brave person, but you're often not called to, like I said, fight the dragon. But for fantasy, you can sort of live vicariously through somebody and experience those great moments, or those not great moments, in a much more extreme way than if you're reading a realist novel, which is also valuable in its own way.
It's exaggerated, but it's also subtle in the ways that it gets you to see your life in a new way.
Yes. Oh, that is such a good segue to this quote that I found. Sanderson read Dragon's Bane by Hambly. It says, when he finished, he recalled thinking, wait a minute, I think I just finished a fun story about slaying a dragon, and I think I understand my mom better. That lesson stayed with me my whole life and my whole career. And I just love that, because it's just, you know, who expects to learn more about their own family just by reading a seemingly random fantasy novel? And this, it works for all novels, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that fantasy shouldn't be excluded.
I definitely learned a lot more about life from the Stormlight Archive than from all of my American literature that I read for school. Putting that out there.
Following this fantasy train, he honors old classic fantasy tropes whilst also putting his own twist on them, basically. And I like that he honors things that are of old in a way, because there are things that are classic, and they're classic for a reason. Like, the stories must mean something to people throughout the ages, because they keep being recycled. And, you know, we've got the story of the hero, and the hero's calling, and the reluctant hero, and all these things that set the stage for a really good story. And I don't really have a problem with a story being predictable as long as it's good, but there's only so many of those I'm going to read. Brandon Sanderson manages to take... I have to stop saying Brandon Sanderson. My sentences are 10 times longer.
Mr. Sanderson.
Mr. Sanderson. Mr. Sanderson is able to take these and use what is good about them, but also change them up a little bit so that we get a bit of a twist.
We really only put this in here so that people who love classic literature weren't mad at us for our fantasy section.
Yeah, we love the classics.
Yeah,
sort of.
It's true.
So he apparently doesn't like American literature, but that's
I
her problem.
like it. I just didn't learn much about life. I learned about America in the 80s and stuff.
The 80s? What were you reading?
I don't know what I'm talking about.
Okay, well, anyways.
Well, yeah.
Maybe the 1880s.
That's kind of what I was thinking. I guess when you say 80s, people assume you're talking about the 1980s. Okay, 1880s, whatever. You can see how much I learned. Sanderson is, I think, on the top of the crest of doing new things, and I think he manages that by filling his books with, like homages to classics of fantasy, without them feeling old and stale, because he has so many new twists to them.
And I think that segues perfectly into our next reason, which was that is the subversion of expectations, which we're basically melding the two reasons together. But basically with okay, here's a chosen one story, but wait a second. Everything pointed to this person being the chosen one, and they're not. Something like that. Having plot twists that actually feel so satisfying because you couldn't predict them.
It's super satisfying to be tricked or to be surprised, but it's also satisfying because it's never completely out of the blue, and if you saw it coming, you get rewarded.
Leading into our next reason, we want to comment on his prose, Sanderson's prose, mainly just because online we've found that he's accused of being too simple.
It is very simple, but I've always been irritated by all the criticisms of his prose because I found it so beautiful. The settings are very easy to visualize, as are the characters in them. Everything that's written in a descriptive manner is designed to be easy to visualize. So it's kind of, in many ways, like watching a movie. So it doesn't come across to me as too simple or too basic or too boring, because I'm just too busy enjoying the scene that I'm watching. I don't even always feel like I'm reading. I'm observing a scene happen.
You were reading like some sort of Reddit thread that you were getting all worked up about?
I went straight down the rabbit hole of the prose criticism because I was irritated with it. Because I don't know, people were coming across really mean about the way he writes, which I think was rude. Because
do not insult Mr. Sanderson.
Yeah, they gotta be like what's his name, who wrote the Leatherstocking Tales, and was like, oh, I could do better than that. And his wife was like, okay, then do it. And he tried, and he just stunk. He was really bad at writing. So he kept writing, and then he wrote the Leatherstocking Tales, and now everyone reads them for school, and it's great.
Oh, wasn't it Jane Austen? Didn't he say he could write better than Jane Austen?
Or something like that.
I think he read Jane Austen and said he could do better.
Yeah.
Which,
and eventually he did. Hot take.
Okay, hold on. This isn't a Mrs. Austen podcast, so we will not be commenting further.
Was it a Mrs. or Miss Austen?
Oh, Miss Austen. Yeah, I don't think she got married.
I don't think she did. Yeah, anyway, speaking of the Reddit thread, I wanted to have a shout out to Otterboop. What are your thoughts on Brandon's prose? They said Brandon. We've been saying Mr. Sanderson.
Maybe Otterboop knows Brandon personally.
It's possible. He didn't write the Reddit thread, though. This was just a comment on it that I liked, that said, what's always fascinating to me is that a lot of people call prose his weak spot, but it takes skill and care to write clear, understandable stories that contain such fantastical ideas. So yeah, thanks Otterboop. You put into words everything I ever dreamed of. So shout out. I hope you see this someday.
Yeah. But that does bring us, another, I will always be like, that's a great segue into our next topic, which is that his action scenes, potentially because of the way something came up. Oh, I think it's gonna die. We wanted to focus on his ability to write amazing action scenes. It's kind of hard to tough. It's kind of hard to tough, you know. The very first book that I was reading, one of the main characters got into a fight, maybe like 3 or 4 chapters in, and I was like, is he gonna die? Like, I'm pretty sure he's gonna die, because the stakes were so high. The people he was fighting were so good. It wasn't like a classic stormtrooper battle droid, like everyone just dies.
There's no cannon fodder in Sanderson works. Sanderson is so creative with the fight scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And the stakes and the tension escalate with each one, so they never get boring. They never feel repetitive.
Here comes Cora.
Well, come on.
Cora, come on. Come on. Oh, good girl. All right. All right, Cora's joining in as a fellow Sanderson fan. His magic has rules that are pretty clearly stated. You'll learn more about the magic as the characters learn more about the magic, but he has very clear rules, and it's not some sort of scenario where, you know, people just kind of throwing out magic powers in situations of dire need, and you're like, well, why didn't you do that like 10 times earlier?
In multiple books, there are 20-page long sequences that are almost exclusively action and fighting from multiple perspectives, and you don't get bored because it's incredibly engaging, and because Cora, you're making me lose all my trains of thought.
Every train is getting lost.
Because he keeps utilizing what you know and kind of reshaping it in new ways where you're like, oh, this is a new way you can use this magic. That's really cool. I didn't think of that. That makes me feel like this person is smart when they think of that.
Based off of the way that he writes, eventually you get to the point where you realize he's not afraid to kill off main characters, and that's like a tricky one to praise an author for, because sometimes author, like, just because you do this thing does not make you a good author, because sometimes people just feel like there's shock deaths and stuff. People just want to shock you, or they want to cause an emotional response or something like that, and it just feels a little bit arbitrary. But as long as it works for the story, and so often it serves as a catalyst for the hero's next action, the next thing that they need to do or will do, like, as long as it's building on the plot and pushing the action further, then I'm fine with it. And
Yeah.
I don't want to feel like 100% comfortable that everyone's going to be okay, because then it's a bit boring if you know that everyone's going to be okay. So our next reason was sort of another broad, just about characters, the way he writes characters, the way he stays consistent with them, even as he goes through multiple perspectives throughout chapters or books. There's a lot of scenes where it doesn't feel like there's necessarily action happening. Like, a character will just come and chat with another character, and maybe it doesn't feel like it's pushing the plot forward a ton, but what it does do is sort of allows you to grow closer to the characters. You don't realize that then when you get to these action scenes where something terrible could happen, you're even more attached to these characters, because you feel like you get a little bit more like real life snippets of what it's like to just, be a person, and not every single thing you do is one step towards destroying the evil villain or something like that. Like, sometimes there's downtime.
Yeah, downtime. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, it feels very character driven, in the sense that there's not just this story happening and all these people just kind of happen to be here and get thrown in. You feel like the story is changing because of the characters. You feel like they're the ones who are driving the story forward and changing the events of the plot, which feels great. It makes them feel very real and very alive, and it makes you very attached to them. I guess the main thing I appreciate is how the characters are written from their own perspective and then from the perspective of others.
Yeah.
Because it makes you see elements to each character that you wouldn't otherwise get.
But speaking of loving characters, I think that this takes us then into our next point, where we talk about another reason why we love Mr. Sanderson's writing is his portrayal of mental illness in his books. And I think that...
Oh boy.
Well, yeah, it's a tricky subject, because we definitely want to make it clear that it's not, oh, because you have portrayed this person with mental illness, like, good job, high five, like, you did it, you have inclusion. It's not that. It's more of like a realistic portrayal.
Yeah, it's not about representation, I guess. It's about
writing real people.
It's not like, oh, look, see, here's a person with a mental illness. I'm so great. It's, after books and books, you understand people are struggling things you didn't realize they were struggling with, and it's a great portrayal of just realistic human behavior and life, and it's great because it's not shoving it down your throat. Mm-hmm. It's great because of how subtle it is and how you don't necessarily notice it for quite some time. Levels
of trauma. Like, it's not like he's saying, this person has this problem and that's just who they are. Like, it's part of the story. It's part of what makes the characters more complex. It's part of what, it's something for the characters to overcome.
It's so compassionate and so well portrayed, and you can tell Sanderson has done his research on all things, and he's just very thoughtful and tasteful with his portrayals of characters with mental illnesses. I guess an example I can think of is a character who struggles with addiction, and it's portrayed very compassionately and powerfully, but at the same time, it's never like, oh, this person's just an addict and we just kind of deal with it. It's like, it causes problems, and it's difficult and brutal and painful for all the people involved. And but it's not really like, oh, this person's a terrible person for being an addict. It's very compassionate, but it's not a throwaway.
Yeah, it's not like a forgiving for terrible things that someone might do, sort of.
And people who do terrible things, kind of because of giving up, because of these problems, there are a lot of wake-up calls.
Yeah. Well, I like to think that in Stormlight, there's two very similar characters who struggle with the same things, and one of them manages to overcome to a certain extent some of the issues that he has. They're still there, but he doesn't let it drag him down into just like hopelessness and despair, whereas another person does, and then that leads him to do worse things. And so that's why it's not like, oh, automatically if you have this problem, you're a good person. It's more so just, these are all the people, and these are all the people that have the thing they struggle with, and what do they do with it? And what do they do with it that is potentially inspirational to people who also struggle with such a thing?
Because it's really not about the problem or the illness. It's about the character and how that character manages it or deals with it, which is pretty super. I think we had a Sanderson quote about that somewhere. He says, I didn't sit down to say, all right, what mental disorders can I give my characters? Instead, I said, I'm going to create a realistic and diverse cast, and so some of them are going to have struggles like these. I think in particular something like depression becomes more glaring when you're expected to save the world, and identity issues might become more prevalent if you could literally change your face to become someone else when you wanted to. It gives a lot of good perspective on how one can see oneself, and also how to be more compassionate toward other people who have problems that you don't see on the surface.
Yeah. And that leads us then, I think, to our very final reason. This is my favorite one, which is why we saved it to last. Well, at least why I put it last. And it was in an interview. It was a Daniel Greene interview with Mr. Sanderson himself, and I cannot find it, and I cannot find the quote, but Sanderson said something like, he ultimately has a hopeful view of humanity, in that he believes that most people are either good or trying to be good. And that doesn't mean that he does not have villains in his books that are fantastic, but I just love a book that is hopeful, because to me, a book that is trying to explain just how dark and awful and evil humanity is, and then that's it, doesn't really offer me anything.
There are so many books that are hopeful but bittersweet, which is also brilliant. Love that. Lord of the Rings, looking at you.
I will not say do not weep, for not all tears are an evil.
Ultimately, you know that Sanderson believes in people, and believes in the future, and believes in hope.
And there are characters who are evil in that they are trying to do something. They're trying to reach a good, but they believe that they can do anything to reach that good. So commit evil to reach that good. So there's tons of complexity there with the good versus evil plotline.
At the end of the day, Sanderson believes in good.
Yeah.
And that's great.
Big fan of that.
Yeah, I love that. I think in the future we're hoping to make more videos that are more deep dives into specific topics that interest us, and hopefully interest an audience as well. But this is a good way to start, and hopefully a good way to get more people to start reading Mr. Sanderson's wonderful bibliography.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you next time.
Yeah, catch you later. Bye.